Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. Minimizing our sins is almost a national pastime. We love to figure out ways to play up our strengths and ignore our moral and spiritual failings. We can even find ourselves overlooking the sins in the lives of others, most likely because we would prefer that they extend to us the same courtesy. But God cannot and will not overlook sin in the lives of His people. And that was going to be another painful lesson learned by King David. In 2 Samuel chapter 14, verses 1 through 17, David is going to allow himself to be unknowingly manipulated by Joab. This friend was so concerned with David's despair over Absalom's exile and so desperate to see David move on with his life that he concocted a plan to persuade David to absolve Absalom of all guilt. This well-intentioned friend would go against the revealed will of God and counsel David to do what he believed to be best for his family and the kingdom. But Joab failed to remember that God takes sin seriously. More than 3 years had passed since Absalom had arranged and carried out the murder of his half-brother Amnon, out of revenge for raping his sister Tamar. Absalom had fled, knowing he was guilty and deserving of death. He had lived in exile in the land of Geshur the entire time, and while David thought about him every day, he did nothing to mete out justice for what his son had done. And this whole sordid affair would have been well known to all the people of Israel. It would have been common knowledge that one of the king's sons had raped his half-sister, and had then been murdered by her brother. They would have been well aware of Absalom's exile, and the rumor mills would have been busy with all kinds of gossip and speculation. That's when Joab, the king's friend and military commander, decided to take action. He determined that it would be in the best interest of the kingdom for David to allow Absalom to return. We're not told why Joab felt compelled to do this, but there's no indication that any of his efforts had the blessing of God. Nowhere in the passage do we hear of him seeking or receiving a word from God. This would appear to have been his own idea, and the fruit of it would bear evidence that it was not within God's will. When Joab saw how much David longed for Absalom, he concocted a plan to try and convince David to forgive and forget. Perhaps remembering how Nathan the prophet had used a story to trick David into confessing his sin with Bathsheba, Joab came up with a similar strategy. He hired a woman to tell a completely fabricated story to David that entailed the murder of her son by his brother. Her clansmen, she said, wanted to put the second son to death for having murdered his brother, but she described herself to David as a widow with no other sons to protect or provide for her. The living son was her last hope. If he was put to death, she would be helpless and hopeless. Her story, while somewhat similar to that of Absalom and Amnon, had some glaring differences. Absalom's murder of Amnon had not been in the heat of an argument and the result of uncontrolled passion. In other words, his was not a case of unpremeditated murder. He had planned it for over 2 years. His murder of Amnon had been calculated and carefully orchestrated. And the execution of Absalom for the murder of his brother would not have left David destitute and alone. He was the king. And technically, in spite of what Joab said, Absalom was not the heir to the throne. Amnon would have been, but he had been killed. Next in line would have been Chileab, David's second-born son. And little did Joab know that God had already made a determination to make Solomon the next king of Israel. But Joab did what he thought was best. He believed that by getting David to allow Absalom to return, things would return to normal in the kingdom. But the thing we must remember when reading this story is that God had already given His will concerning matters of this nature. In the book of Numbers, we find His divine provision for those who commit murder by accident. God established 6 cities of refuge, designed as places where the guilty could go for safety until their case could be judged appropriately. But God had made it clear that acts of premeditated murder were not covered. But if someone strikes and kills another person with a piece of iron, it is murder, and the murderer must be executed. Or if someone with a stone in his hand strikes and kills another person, it is murder, and the murderer must be put to death. Or if someone strikes and kills another person with a wooden object, it is murder, and the murderer must be put to death. The victim's nearest relative is responsible for putting the murderer to death. When they meet, the avenger must put the murderer to death. So if someone hates another person and pushes him or throws a dangerous object at him and he dies, it is murder. or if someone hates another person and hits him with a fist and he dies, it is murder. In such cases, the avenger must put the murderer to death when they meet. Numbers 35, verses 16 through 21. Absalom deserved death, but Joab was determined to get the king to grant him a pardon. And his reasoning, passed on to David by the woman, would be that this would be best for the kingdom. She even suggests that it would be what God would want. Certainly we must die, and are like water spilled on the ground that cannot be gathered up again. But God does not take away life. Instead, he devises ways for the banished to be restored. 2 Samuel 14, verse 14. She appealed to God's mercy and love. She emphasized his forgiveness. But in doing so, she painted a one-dimensional view of God, conveniently leaving out his justice and holiness. God cannot overlook sin. He can't turn a blind eye to the sins of men and simply pardon them without doing something about them. There would be a day coming when God would provide permanent forgiveness for sins of all kinds, but it would be at the cost of his own Son's life. Payment had to be made. The author of Hebrews reminds us, "For without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness." Hebrews 9, verse 22. Joab wanted everything back the way it had been. He was willing to overlook the sins of Absalom if it would get David back to being his old self. This whole scene was the brainchild of Joab and was intended to get David to overlook the guilt of his son and allow him to return home with no justice having been served. David, seemingly susceptible to a good story, would give in to the woman's tale and her plea for David to allow Absalom to be restored. This decision, like so many made by David, would come back to haunt him. He did not see God's will in the matter, but went with his gut. It seems that the woman, armed with the words of Joab, knew exactly what was needed to get to David's heart. He longed for Absalom and was just looking for an excuse to bring him home. He didn't want to mete out justice, which is why he had left Absalom living in the land of his maternal grandfather for 3 years. Now David seemed to have a viable reason for doing what he wanted to do all along: absolve Absalom of guilt. But God had not forgotten what Absalom had done. And contrary to the wise woman's words, God does take away life. He had taken the life of David's newborn son because of his sin with Bathsheba. God had taken the life of Achan and his entire family for bringing sin into the camp. See Joshua 7. God is a just and holy God. He is righteous and always does what is right. David could forgive and forget Absalom's sin, but God could not and would not.